Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Matt Hardy. I'm the Program Director for Planning and Performance Management here at AASHTO. I'd like to extend a warm welcome on behalf of AASHTO and the Transportation Performance Management Pooled Fund Program. It's led by Christos Xenofantos from the Rhode Island DOT to this webinar. We're happy to see so many attendees today. I think when we last checked for registration, it was around 200 people. So we're very glad that you could all join us. The Transportation Performance Management Pooled Fund Program, it's sponsored by AASHTO in cooperation with FHWA. We are pleased to sponsor this webinar series. Today is our 12th bi-monthly TPM webinar series sponsored by the Pooled Fund with the support from the AASHTO Committee on Performance-Based Management, as well as leadership from FHWA. Sharing knowledge and building capacity are critical aspects of the Pooled Fund program. The purpose of the webinar series is to support the broader TPM community by sharing lessons learned, ideas, and knowledge with the transportation performance management community. So it's not geared just for state DOTs, it's for the transportation community in general. And when I was looking at the registration, I saw that we went well beyond just the state DOT, so I'm very happy to see that. I do want to mention that I talked about the Pooled Fund, the Transportation Performance Management Pooled Fund program. It is transitioning to a technical service program, an AASHTO technical service program. So we invite all the state DOT attendees to encourage your agency, your state DOT, to sign up for the AASHTO technical service program so that we can continue to bring you engaging webinars and other capacity building resources like this in the future. Please feel free to email me at mhardy@aashto.org. And again, we are at the end of this year, this current pooled fund program ends, and we have started the process of transitioning this to an AASHTO technical service program. Again, email me, mhardy@aashto.org for more information about that and what you do need to do if you're a state DOT and want to continue to participate. Today's topic of our webinar is on target setting. This interactive webinar will look at several perspectives and ongoing research related to target setting. I think you're going to really enjoy today's presentations on the topic of target setting. Our webinar today will highlight some of the important work going on around the country and at the national level related to this topic. I'm personally looking forward to hearing about the techniques for setting effective targets, as we are now in the second performance period since state DOTs and NPOs had to start to set and track track national performance targets. And so without further notice, let me turn it over to Hyana Park of Spy Pond Partners to share our agenda for today's webinar and who will be our MC. Hyana, all yours.
Thanks, Matt. Before I review the agenda, I'd like to cover a few brief logistics. First, for more information on this webinar series, visit tpm-portal.com and click the TPM webinar series under events in the main menu. Links to the video and slides from today's webinar and archived content from previous webinars are posted on the AASHTO TPM portal site. Abby has also put a link to today's slides in the chat, so you can download them there as well. So now for the agenda. First up today, we have Matt Hardy, who will cover an analysis AASHTO did of the national data. Next, we have Alexis Kuklenski, who will provide an introduction on behalf of Federal Highways, and Walt Satterfield will provide FHWA's perspective on target setting for national performance measures. Next, Michael Grant from ICF will present the latest guidance and information about upcoming workshops related to NCHRP Project 2307, effective methods for setting transportation performance targets. Anna Batista will round out our presentations with findings from NCHRP Project 02-27, Making Targets Matter, Managing Performance to Enhance Decision-Making. And now we'll have time, and then we'll have time for Q&A at the end of the presentations. Please enter any questions you have in the chat, but also since we're in Zoom, you'll be able to unmute yourself and ask your questions at the end of our session. So let's get started with our program. First up, Matt Hardy, Program Director for Planning and Performance Management at AASHTO, will talk about the analysis AASHTO recently completed for the national TPM data set reported to federal highways. Take it away,
Thanks,
Matt.
Thanks, Yana. Laura, if you just want to keep on sharing your slides, that might be easiest. All right, so this is some very preliminary analysis that I did, and I'm going to talk about it at the very end. Some more exciting work that's going to be going on related to an NCHRP project that we got funded through the Committee on Performance-Based Management. And I also want to point out that the other two projects, NCHRP projects that both Anna and Michael are going to talk about these were ideas that started with the AASHTO Committee on Performance-Based Management, as well as our partners over at TRB with the Performance Management Committee over there. So just want to highlight that strong partnership that we have between AASHTO and the TRB committees. And what you are seeing, what Michael and Anna are going to talk about, is a result of that great partnership. And hopefully with this, the project that I'm going to talk about at the very end of my slides, that we'll have another great partnership between TRB, NCHRP, and the AASHTO committees as well. So what I'm going to talk about is very sort of preliminary. This is work that I did basically, did get some help with some consultants to do some other sort of preliminary work as well, that I'll kind of show a little bit of, kind of whet your appetite. But what we're hoping to do is to, now that we got this a larger NCHRP project funded, is to do a more in-depth, robust, authoritative analysis of the data that all the states have been reporting, because we are at the end of that first reporting period back in December of 2021. So next slide, Lori. So we have been on this performance management journey for quite a while. This all started back in 2012 when the MAP 21 was signed into law. I still have my book, my MAP 21 book, with all the different notes in there. And it's been a long journey. It started in 2013, 14, 15, even 16 with the whole NPRM process, notice of proposed rulemaking, and the new regulations coming out from FHWA. And then once that was completed, we entered into the first reporting period. Excuse me. The first 4-year reporting period, where states and MPOs were establishing targets for the safety ones. That was every year, for the sort of the asset measures, pavement and bridge condition, and then for the PM3, those operational system performance measures, it was sort of a 4-year target with the 2-year interim in there, kind of updating it. So we have been through that first reporting period, and we have some good data. So I think it's very timely that we kind of look at that data to kind of see how were states and MPOs setting targets, and also very timely because states and MPOs are going to be establishing targets for the next reporting period, that we have the results of these two important NCHRP projects that will be talked about today to help you, the transportation community, establish targets in the future, so that we can sort of make targets matter. And then how do you set effective targets? So both those projects very complementary to each other that cover different aspects. But again, we've been on this journey for over 10 years. I've been at AASHTO for 12 years. So it seems like this is like my baby, and it's growing up. So it's pretty cool to see. Next slide, please. When AASHTO, when I think about this sort of performance management paradigm, what we've been thinking about is number one, establishing targets, right? How do you establish targets? How do you set aggressive targets? Do you set aggressive targets versus achievable targets? Like, what's the purpose of target setting? How do you do that? Maximizing performance using it versus kind of what I say is playing the game, right? Do you just kind of do a check mark in the box? Is what we have to do because that's what the law requires. How do we use this more, not just because the law requires it, but it makes good business sense? So that's the idea of sort of establishing the targets. The second aspect is communication. How do you tell the story about this? I've been doing this a lot just in my job, that we can get very technical, we can get very detailed in the weeds of target setting. How do you communicate that with the public, with the lay people who don't have, literally, bachelor's of science, masters, PhDs in this, that have to understand, why are you setting the target like this? What's the purpose of it? You didn't achieve it. Does that mean you failed? Maybe, maybe not. So that's the idea that we're trying to figure out, how do you communicate this story that we can tell with targets, and then creating the idea of transparency, regardless of what the results are. Right, we don't want to try to hide anything. We want to try to tell everybody, here's what we're trying to do. Here's where we're trying to get to. The balance, there is this balance between federal, state, local measures, right? There's the federal requirements. Each state, I'm sure out there, has, what their goals and objectives are from the state perspective, and then the locals as well, right? Each region, each county, each city, has their own performance metrics, targets, things that they're trying to achieve. So how do we balance this all together? And it's not a versus, it's an and, right? It's not federal versus state versus local. It's the federal measures and the state measures and the local measures. How do we make it all work together? And then finally, how do we make it accountable? How do we use this to drive accountability, to drive data-driven decisions? That's what we're trying to do with this, I think. So that's the paradigm that we're in. And I think with the data, with the measures, we're trying to figure out how can we address all four of these topics moving forward. Next slide, please. So the first sort of data set that I want to talk about is the safety. This is the one that I've been able to sort of look at with the most depth right now. So this is, some of you may have seen some of this data before, some of it's fairly new, but just wanted to touch on it. So next slide. So FHWA every year for the safety data, they have to do a significant progress determination. Did states make significant progress? If a state met 4 out of the 5 performance measures, the targets that they set for their 5 safety measures, they made significant progress. If they didn't, if they met 3, 2, or 1, they did not make significant progress. It's fairly straightforward. Black and white, you either did or you did not. For the target, you either met your target or you did not. If you did not meet your target by 0.01%, you did not meet your target. But if you exceeded your target by 100%, you still met your target. So there's some nuances there that we're trying to sort of sort through. But it's very simple, I would say, straightforward in terms of, are you making significant progress or not? But what I would say is that I'm not sure that tells the entire story. And that gets into some of the nuances that we start talking about. So you can see the data here. It's not going in the correct direction, I would say, in terms of making significant progress from that very, outward looking, straightforward. Are you making significant progress? Since 2018, less and less states have been making significant progress. And that's just what the data says. We're not trying to hide it or anything like that. That's what the data says. We go to the next slide. And the question becomes, how are you making significant progress? States have 2 ways to make significant progress. They can either exceed their target or they can do better than the baseline. And there's sort of I don't want to say complicated, but there's a calculation with an equation that has to be done to sort of figure out what's that baseline. So it allows some flexibility for the states to set an aggressive target, knowing that they have that baseline they can kind of fall back on to still make significant progress. So this data here on the table on the right is just showing, how many of those states needed that baseline to make significant progress. And in 2018, it was 11 states, 2019, it was 8, and 2020, it was 7. So they needed that baseline. So they set a target that they did not meet, but they did better than the baseline, which means they were able to make significant progress. So a few conclusions: the number of states did decline. Less states are requiring the baseline. So does that mean, are they setting better targets? We don't know. We can't pull that from the data yet. But the baseline assessment is an important backstop to enable the state DOTs to establish more aggressive targets, I would say. Next slide. Then we can get detailed into, okay, of the actual individual targets. So that was at the aggregate level, the individual targets that states, for different measures, the 5 measures: fatality, the rate, serious injury rate, and then non-motorized. We can get into lots of details about, did a state meet the target or did they not meet the targets? And this, again, I think is good information, good data to kind of know about. And I think it tells a story. Again, we haven't had time with this NCHRP project, hopefully we will, to be able to dive deeper into the data to understand, are states easier? Is it easier? I don't want to say easier. Are they better at meeting targets for some of the more mature measures like fatality fatality rate, serious injury, as opposed to some of the less mature or less used performance measures that have not been around as long, like the non-motorized one. Don't know yet, but again, this is the information there. If you go to the next slide. This is one in terms of what kind of targets are states setting when it comes to the 5 safety performance measures. Are they setting performance that is declining, or meaning the target's increasing, right? The number of fatalities or serious injuries is increasing, or are they setting performance where it's improving, or the number of fatalities, serious injuries, et cetera, are decreasing? And we just sort of analyzed it here. Some of this is based, you have to have a couple years worth of data to understand what the baseline is. And, is that the target setting, is that better or worse than the baseline to determine is it a declining or an improving target? But again, this is the data. We haven't looked at it, analyzed it to be able to come to, certain conclusions about it, but we are starting to kind of look at that data. And the other aspect is, with the performance measures, they can get a little more complicated, right? Fatality is it's a very simple measure because it's just the count of fatalities or serious injuries, the count of the serious injuries. Once you start normalizing it like a rate or something, you have a denominator, it starts getting a little more complicated. So what's driving that rate? Is it because people are driving less? Is it because they're driving more? Is it something that the state is doing? Was a safety, treatment or something like that? So once we get into some of those measures that have, a numerator or denominator and multiple, all those things going on, we have to sort of tease out what's driving that measure. What's the state or the MPO or the locality doing to actually have an effect on that measure? And it's things that we are thinking about and trying to understand. Next slide, please. This one is also interesting. It gets to the accuracy of the targets. So a state sets a performance, a target, and there's, with the current assessment that FHWA does, they either met the target or they did not meet the target. So if you overestimated, if you underestimated, then you did not meet your target. If you overestimated, then you met your target. So how accurate is it? So the question could become, is it more about the accuracy of the target that you set, and did you meet it? Were you within 2% of what that target was? Or is it more about just setting a target and being, and meeting that target, showing an improvement or something like that? And what this data is showing is that most of the states, when they set their target, what the actual number is showing is that lots of them, for example, in 2018 for the fatality, 34 states were within 5% of the actual number. They're doing a pretty good job of figuring out what that target is going to be. 43 states were within 10% of the actual number. So again, it comes down to, how do you measure whether or not a state or a locality or an MPO or somebody, met the target? Is it just a black or white, either yes, you did, or you did not, you over, you under, or is it within a range? And that's some of the data and the information that we're trying to sort of tease through and tease out to understand what makes sense to sort of assess whether or not a transportation agency did make significant progress. Again, this is just preliminary. And it's more questions that we have than we don't have answers right now. Next slide, please. And then this just shows what the average the average difference is between all of these different performance measures. Did they overestimate? Did they underestimate? And we have it for the fatalities, the count and the rate, serious injury, and then non-motorized. And again, data that's interesting, I think. Again, trying to figure out how best to use it. But again, if you kind of look at it, most of these numbers are, less than 10%. So on average, most of the states, the data that we have, they're looking pretty good when it comes to, again, on average, are they hitting their targets or not? And then that down there, the conclusion, sometimes the difference between meeting a target and not meeting a target can be less than 0.03%. So is it better that a state misses their target by 0.03%, versus they overestimated it by 100% or 50% or 20%. And I'm not saying I have the right answer. They're just questions that we're kind of throwing out there to better understand what's going on. And if you go to the next slide. So we're also trying to figure out how do we visualize excuse me, just understanding this is the accuracy of those targets. You can kind of see that where that black line is. If you're to the right of it, that means you met your target. If you're to the left of it, you did not meet your target. This is for 2018 data. It's out there. It's been out there for quite a while. Next slide, please. And there were also, so that was the safety data. We also have the first full reporting set of the bridge, pavement, and then operational system performance measures as well. And we're going through trying to understand how to analyze it and how to visualize it. So this is just showing the bridge analysis that we have the data. And you know, the picture on the graph on the left is the difference between the actual and what the target was, and then a different way of visualizing that in terms of the accuracy with a different type of visualization over on the right side. You want to be closer to that blue line than, you know, into the green or to the red. And if you go to the next slide, the same thing for pavement, something similar. And if you go to the next slide, we're looking at interstate reliability. So we have all the measures out there. We have the data. It's just a matter of trying to find time to kind of do the analysis. And if you go to the next slide, what I did do is kind of go through and look at the data. So this is for the 2018 for the first 4-year target that states had to set for themselves. Just, you know, asking that question: what kind of targets did a state set? Was it showing an improvement in performance or a decline in performance? And again, safety is the upper left, pavement and bridges is the upper right, and then down below are 2 of the system performance measures on travel time, reliability, and then in freight. So for travel time and freight, you can see that a majority, 43 of the states, set declining performance measures, meaning that, you know, the reliability would not improve. The freight, you know, the truck travel reliability would not improve. And then about 50% for many of the safety measures, and then over for the asset measure condition. You know, you can kind of see there. So it's not saying that states, you know, the interstate's non-interstate's going to go from good to poor. It's just saying that there's likely to be a decline from poor, from good likely into good. Sorry, from good, not into poor, but into I'm having a brain drain. I'm forgetting the other to medium, not the good, the medium. So you have anyway. So that's the pavement. And then the bridges. Again, just looking at the data, the targets, the type of targets. Thank you. Fair. From good to fair condition. Thank you for that. Anyways, just a different, trying to look at the data and trying to understand kind of what's going on with it in terms of targets. And if you go to the next slide, and all these slides are available if you want to look at them. And this is all publicly available data. So it's not data that you couldn't get your hands on. I'm just trying to sort of analyze it, visualize it, kind of look at it. So these were some questions that we've been trying to ask as the Committee on Performance-Based Management for all of the different performance management areas, PM 1, 2, and 3. So how many states are making progress? How many states, you know, make significant progress on a regular basis? How far off were the targets from the actual numbers? What kind of targets did they set? Improving, declining, you know, that kind of thing. What kind of techniques did they use? Is there a correlation between, you know, what kind of target they set and then the technique they use to actually make it, you know, to set their target? And then finally, what was the impact, if we can, of any of the transportation policy goals out there, like TZD, towards zero deaths, complete streets, et cetera, on target achievement? So can we show that connection between some of these broader policy goals, target setting, and then actually making progress towards those targets? That's more of a long-term sort of looking at the outcomes and trying to draw some of those connections and everything. But I think that's an important question as part of that performance management feedback cycle, to say, hey, these were our goals. These were the targets that we set for the performance measures. We went out and made we constructed projects. We did things. This is the kind of performance that we got by constructing those projects. Feed that back into the decision-making process to make better, more informed decisions. That's what we're trying to do with, I think, this performance management paradigm, establish that feedback loop. And finally, I think I'm 1 minute over, which I apologize for. We do have a new project. This was approved back in April by the Research, the AASHTO R&I Committee. It's for all the consultants out there that want to respond to it. It's NCHRP 08-168, analysis and assessment of the national performance management data. There are 2 goals. We want to prepare an authoritative analysis and assessment of this national performance management data and provide recommendations on future capacity building activities. What kind of work needs to be done to sort of support the states, the MPOs, the locals in doing this type of work. And then 3 objectives, actually analyze that data and the 3 performance measurement areas. Try to develop that comprehensive story about what is all this telling. And then finally, the identification of future capacity building needs related to the performance measures. They are seeking panel nominations right now. So if you're interested in being on the project panel that oversees this project, please, I will post this in the chat. Nominate yourself, nominate a friend, that sort of thing, because we're looking for good people to be on the project to help oversee it. With that, I'm going to stop. I'll turn it back over to Hyana to introduce my good friend Alexis from FHWA to give their perspective. Sorry for going over a little bit.
No problem, Matt. That was really valuable. All right, now Alexis Kuklenski and Walt Satterfield will provide an introduction and federal perspective on target setting. Ms. Kuklenski is the acting team leader for the Transportation Performance and Asset Management team in FHWA's Office of Infrastructure. Alexis joined Federal Highways in 2010 as a community planner in the Wisconsin division. She joined the TPM team in 2014 during the writing of the first TPM regulations. She's been part of developing, implementing, and growing the TPM program since the beginning. Walt Satterfield is a transportation specialist with the Federal Highways Resource Center, TPM Asset Management, Freight and Analytics team, also known as TAFA. Prior to joining the TAFA team in July of 2020, Walt served as the transportation planner for the Federal Highway Wyoming Division Office, where he supported various program areas and discipline activities, including planning, right-of-way, freight, TPM, and asset management. Alexis and Walt, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for that. I appreciate it. So it takes care of my introduction. I'm Alexis Kuklenski. I am the acting team leader for our asset management and TPM team. And just on behalf of Federal Highway, I want to thank you all for joining us today. And I want to thank all of our presenters and everyone who's worked so hard to bring these webinars together. So we do appreciate it. So I'm going to just kind of go over TPM very generally as a concept and touch on a few of the target elements of it. Then I'm going to turn it over to Walt to give his perspective on target setting within the TPM framework. So just for anyone who's new to this, TPM is a strategic approach that uses system information to make investment and policy decisions to achieve national performance goals. The TPM targets are short-term targets that are intended to lead to the longer-term targets that are set in long-range plans and asset management plans. And together, these short and long-term targets are going to work together to help us reach our national goals. And there are 7 national goals, but they're things like reducing congestion, improving system efficiency and good movements, furthering environmental sustainability. The TPM targets are not intended to be an end goal. They're only representative of a single point along our path towards our future goals. Federal Highway, we have a definition of TPM, or Transportation Performance Management, as a strategic approach that uses system information to make investment and policy decisions to achieve national performance goals. And all of our requirements related to TPM are in 23 CFR 490, and they come together to create a framework for TPM. So transportation performance management is systematically applied. It's a regular ongoing process. So our safety measures have annual targets, reporting and assessment. The rest of our performance measures have biennial reporting, and you're establishing 2- and 4-year targets at the state level, and at the MPO level, it will be 4-year targets and sometimes 2-year targets. So this framework that we have within TPM provides a key information to help our decision makers understand the consequences of their investment decisions across their transportation assets. And the regular establishment of targets and the associated reporting is intended to help break down silos, and it allows issues to be considered across all of the program areas. You know, entities have budgets. We all know this. We all are working within constrained funding, constrained time, constrained resources. So the targets are going to reflect the trade-offs across all of our performance areas. The TPM framework is also part of improving communications between decision makers, our stakeholders, and the traveling public. So the targets and reporting are showing where things are at now and where they're headed in the future, and also, you know, where they've been. As these programs mature and we get more time under our belt, we're going to have more historic trends of past performance that we can overlay with our targets and where we're intending to go in the future. TPM also helps us ensure that our targets and measures are developed in cooperation with the state DOTs, are developing them in cooperation with the MPOs and the other local entities, and that those targets are being developed based on data and objective information. So meaningful targets are what we're always striving for, and that really requires that there's coordination, collaboration between the state DOTs, MPOs, and our relevant agencies, and they have to coordinate not only on the establishment of targets, but the analysis of the data and the programming of the projects to achieve those targets. So while TPM has been around for a while, you know, the last 10 years, it is still a relatively young program, and we are growing in many areas, but we know that meaningful coordination on target establishment, analysis of data is an area where we can grow. And we are hoping to see active and ongoing coordination in this area in the future. So while TPM does have some requirements for coordination, it's really up to the state DOT and the MPOs and local agencies to work together to identify and implement what is meaningful in their unique situation, so that they can work together to establish those meaningful targets that are going to allow them to achieve their goals. So today we are definitely talking about targets, but I just want to remind everyone it doesn't stop with targets. Those targets that are established for the purposes of TPM, they need to be used in developing plans. They need to feed into the programming of projects, the investments. So it's really all of these pieces work together as part of this TPM framework. Targets can be kind of seen as a starting point, but it's certainly not the end all be all. So yeah, I think that's kind of it for me. Walt, I'm going to turn it over to you. You can kind of give your take on target setting for Federal Highway.
All right, thank you, Alexis. And I'll echo your thanks and gratitude to the folks who put this webinar series together. Really appreciate that. And certainly for everybody participating today for your time and interest. I think these are really valuable as well. And I just appreciate the opportunity to be able to share some perspectives from the FHWA Resource Center. I don't have slides today, but I wanted to share some thoughts and observations specifically from our Resource Center perspective regarding some of my team's work involving TPM and target setting as of late. And over the last couple of years, and operating primarily in a virtual environment, as you can imagine, we've had the opportunity to provide training and technical assistance to states and MPOs to support the advancement and implementation of TPM. And recognizing there's a diverse set of needs among transportation agencies tied to these topics, TPM and decision making. Our goal is to adapt our learning events and technical services to best meet the needs of the customers and what they're dealing with and facing, some of their interests of today. So we deliver technical services both virtually and in person. They may be multi-day learning events or just short 2-hour sessions on any specific topic that our team deals with, as mentioned in the intro. And typically our TPM services focus not just on the federal TPM requirements, but just the data-driven decision-making approach as a whole that can be supportive and will be supportive of TPM. Our most recent technical services have covered a range of TPM topics, including the different implementation phases of TPM, thinking about the strategic direction, the overarching analysis that drives agency goals and objectives, planning analysis, alignments to long-range plans, metropolitan transportation plans, and so on, programming investments, the connections to STIPs and TIPs, reporting and communication, really an important piece, just telling that performance story. And then I think an area that's continuing to emerge in the world of TPM is the monitoring, evaluation, and adjustment. So assessing, really your target objectives and achievement and creating processes to evaluate how decisions that are made are actually influencing target outcomes. And our team addresses various data and analysis tools for TPM and decision-making and coordination and documentation. That's a common theme that tends to come up a lot. And last but not least, we do very specific sessions on target setting approaches. And up front, I wanted to highlight and recognize some synergies between Matt's observations that he spoke on earlier and what I want to share with you today and what we're seeing nationally. And so for the sake of my comments, I've categorized these observations into 5 thematic buckets just to try to organize this to some degree, especially without slides. Our first bucket relates to the types and variety of performance measures and targets, and Matt alluded to that as well. And the fact that states and MPOs they're establishing their own state and regional measures that reflect local priorities, and they complement the federal measures in many cases. These measures and associated targets can include things such as equity and resiliency, complete streets, things that are common things that we're hearing about, and they're relating to key initiatives found in bill. And many of these agencies have been working on these measures and targets even before bill. So there's some great momentum there heading in that direction. Looking at targets on accessibility and a variety of congestion measures, number of incidents, duration, speed, delay, things that speak to the region's needs specifically and can complement the federal performance measures as well. States and MPOs are looking to balance federal highway measures with other multimodal measures too, and thinking of how that complete transportation network fits together. And so I think that's an encouraging observation. So that's bucket number 1. Our second bucket relates to data and analysis approaches for TPM, which is definitely a big emphasis area that our team's focused on the last couple of years. Certainly, there's ongoing state and MPO interests and desire to better utilize existing data resources that are out there. And I think as we advance and mature with TPM, the good news is there are more data sets to evaluate and some trend data that can grow to be more meaningful as those data sets continue to grow each year we progress into TPM. Definitely significant interest we're hearing about with emerging data and big data sets. That's been covered on some other AASHTO webinars as well, but looking at resources such as crowdsourcing, mobile phone apps, emerging tech, connected vehicle, autonomous vehicle, how that can be integrated into target setting, pulling in multimodal data and bike ped transit activities and those types of multimodal measures that can support target setting. And that crosses both state DOTs and MPOs in terms of interest in those types of new emerging data resources and big data resources. With that said, there's a growing focus on data management and governance that's occurring nationally, not just to support TPM, but also strategically to meet the needs of the agency, project needs, program needs, and moving away from specific data silos. We're hearing about some common challenges, and some of those relate back to big data sets, emerging data sets, But also, some agencies are struggling with institutional quality control, missing data challenges that can directly have an impact on TPM. So in response, many agencies are moving towards formalizing data governance approaches to ensure that data is really looked at as an asset, which it is. I mean, it's an asset that needs to be preserved, maintained, and we've heard that discussed in some good peer exchanges hosted by AASHTO fairly recently on data governance approaches. But I think there's a really strong connection to TPM implementation with that said. And finally, some common challenges on the data and analytical fronts. I think this is pretty common in terms of staff time availability, funding constraints, staffing turnover, and how to address that, and continuity of information, and how that can be preserved and passed on to new employees. Coordination with partner agencies, thinking about the challenges there, and different data and resources that go along with that. Those are some common things that we hear about, and we try to present some good examples, practices, and effective practices that other states and regions are doing to address some of those challenges. So that was bucket number 2. On to bucket number 3. And again, this is 3 of 5. This relates to trends in the alignment and integration of TPM to the plans and programs that agencies are working with. And there's a variety of approaches to link objectives, investment strategies, and performance measures across these plans. And the reality is, in our experience, we haven't found a magic bullet to really facilitate, successful coordination across the board. It takes a lot of coordination. It takes a conscious effort really to ensure that alignment is occurring, especially as new plans are being developed or updated and across different program areas. States and MPOs are also learning how to better document and report performance trends from our observations, really coming up with some innovative practices and ways to tell that performance story. And some state DOTs have developed specific guidance for how MPOs could document how regional projects are contributing to those state targets. So that, again, an example of great opportunities to work together and create some synergies between states and regions. And some DOTs are putting additional focus on ensuring better alignment between programming within the STIP and performance-based plans, and relating back to other plans such as the asset management plan, or a state freight plan, or a regional freight plan, and how that connects to STIP to those STIP priorities that are developed. Okay, bucket number 4 relates to challenges and enhancements of project and program evaluation and prioritization approaches. So that is really, linking decisions to planning and to programming, and something that we're hearing about from the implementation side, and a lot of interest in enhancing that process. Looking at the project selection criteria that are being developed, and how that can be data driven, especially linked to specific TPM performance areas. And finding that alignment between criteria with both federal, state, regional, and local performance measures is an important piece. One fortunate thing with Bill and IIJA, there's an opportunity for financial support for states and larger MPOs, those above 200,000 in population, to develop data-driven approaches to planning that can also incorporate the public benefit elements of that. This is a competitive grant program known as the Project Prioritization Pilots, which will support those data-driven priorities and project selection criteria, really emphasizing public accessibility to that. So I think that's an encouraging opportunity for states and larger MPOs to consider as far as a discretionary grant program, and supporting these data-driven efforts. There's also interest on cross-program trade-off analysis tools, and really that's a product of, if every agency had enough money to do everything they needed to do, they wouldn't have to make trade-offs. But that's really often not the reality. And so utilizing tools such as the MODAT tool, or multi-objective decision analysis tool, which was developed through NCHRP and is now available on the AASHTO site, that's a good example that our team has used and leveraged, where we've actually demonstrated how the MODAT tool can support project decisions that directly relate to agency goals and performance areas. So we've demoed that tool. We've walked through the steps of that tool with different agencies, and it's been really well received. And I think more and more agencies are exploring the type and use of trade-off tools to help frame decision-making and ensure that they're supporting their performance objectives through their decisions, especially with programming. And fifth and final buckets relates to what is a really important theme of coordination and documentation. And TPM, as we all know at this point, relies on close coordination between state DOTs and MPOs. And building upon existing relationships and forums that have existed even pre-TPM implementation is one practice that we're seeing a lot. But some states and MPOs are starting new structures in place where they're developing new groups, new committees, and processes to help facilitate that. And a common theme that we're hearing about within that is just data sharing and leveraging resources across the agencies, knowing that funding, you know, again, it's a funding issue, it's a staff issue, how to best get the use of the tools that are out there, and really having, again, connections to decisions that can be supported from both the state standpoint and the regional standpoint. So I think that can help foster some analytical consistency in terms of how decisions are made between different state and MPO regions. Many agencies are very focused on documentation of TPM processes, which I think is extremely wise. And some are using different formats to do that. You know, we see it in the form of SOPs or reference manuals or even web-based, you know, like a SharePoint type of a setup. And that document is very critical. It helps support how decisions are made, telling that story to agency leadership, to the public, but then also thinking about, you know, when you have new staff wanting to learn about how processes are done related to TPM, how they can pick that up and carry that. There's some continuity there with documentation, which is a really key outcome. So those are the 5 buckets. And of course, you know, we're trying to fit everything in. There's a lot of steps and components to making TPM work and successful. So I guess I'll try to narrow it down one more time. Top 3 takeaways.
Hey, Walt.
Yes.
We're kind of over time right now. If you could be quicker, that would be helpful.
I'm right at the tail end. So I was just
okay.
Yeah, I think that could be a good wrap. Final plug, the Resource Center is here to support your needs. Please reach out to your division office if you have interest in tailored services or technical assistance. And with that said, Fiona, I will turn it back to you.
Thanks, Walt. Our next speaker is Michael Graham from ICF. Michael will provide a summary of the NCHRP Project 2307. Michael is a vice president at ICF with over 25 years of experience in transportation planning, policy, and performance management. And I'm going to skip over the rest, Michael, so that you can get started with your presentation.
Sure, that sounds great. I want to first thank the members of ICF and our team partners who've been working on this study at High Street and Applied Pavement Technology. So I'll provide some highlights. I'll go through some of this quickly on the work we've done under the NCHRP 2307 on effective methods for setting transportation performance targets. Just a brief background, we all know that target setting is a challenging process. There are lots of questions raised within agencies about how to set the target, how high to set the target, and what are things to consider in setting a target. And the purpose of this guide is really to develop and disseminate a practitioner-ready guidebook on methods for target setting, building on the experience that we've had or agencies have had over the last several years in target setting, and take that information to help others identify effective practices. The study involved 3 phases of work. The first phase was foundational, including a review of state DOT performance target setting methods. This built off the Federal Highway Administration TPM dashboard information that's been collected nationally. There were also focus groups and interviews conducted, and then work looking at the mid-period performance reports and how states and states have potentially adjusted their targets as well. We then identified a set of what we consider kind of a scheme of effective target setting methods, and pilots tested that with a set of states who worked with us to analyze those methods and attempt to use them. And the result is a guidebook and outreach that we're excited to be just kicking off actually next week with our first set of workshops that I'll talk about briefly. As an overview and some of what we found, we looked at across all of the different national performance measure areas, but the guidebook identified a couple of common kinds of themes in terms of the types of target setting methods that are used. First, there are, although all of these are data driven, there are some that are much more complex than others and use different types of tools. The first of these is really a policy-based approach. It can be based on data or looking at long-term goals and trends, but using data to then estimate a more specific near-term reduction in order to align with that policy. A second approach is using historical trends. This may involve statistical analysis, or often uses Excel and other types of tools to analyze what those trends look like over time and what the trends suggest future performance may look like. A third approach is what's considered a probabilistic or risk-based approach. In this case, states or agencies would typically look at the range of effects, for instance, for an issue like reliability, and look at the monthly variation or the variation over time in that performance area, and then look at that variation to create upper and lower bounds and consider what might be likely to be achieved in terms of performance in the future. Some also risk-based approaches look at the potential for instance, with reliability, where you have either a segment being reliable or not reliable, for segments that would kind of shift between being reliable and non-reliable or not reliable, and then looking at the risk of those effects in order to account for setting a target. We also have statistical models that account for different explanatory factors. Those often are using a regression model or other type of statistical approach. And finally, there are other types of tools and models like asset management systems, pavement management systems, bridge management systems that are often used as part of the target setting process. I won't dwell on this, but we did have a great set of 7 states that agreed to pilot test some of the methods that were identified as part of this. And that process helped us to refine and also just learn a little bit about the ability of different states to use methods that had been used or documented in the literature and by other states. So the result of this is really a guide that's intended to help state DOTs and MPOs to identify effective methods for setting transportation performance targets. And the resulting guidebook has 3 primary pieces to it. The first part is an overview of target setting methods and tips around target setting. I'll touch briefly on that. The second part is a menu of target setting methods, where for each of these major performance areas, it goes through different methods that may be used, and the user could flip to a particular section of interest. And the third section focuses on target setting for other types of non-required measures, including why you would even set a target for another type of measure and some examples of those. So just to provide some highlights of what's in the guidebook, one thing we note that's useful to consider is agencies often have different philosophies for how they will set their target. You can look at data and you can forecast into the future what your performance is going to be, but there are different philosophies, whether your target should be essentially set at the predicted level, which we can consider kind of a realistic or predictive approach to target setting. Some agencies have more of an aspirational approach, and this is particularly valuable in considering where there are some performance areas where performance trends might not be showing movement in the right direction, but an idea that we need to show a more positive performance outlook. And then there are some more conservative approaches where the agency is really attempting to help assure they attain the target by choosing one that is more likely to be achieved. We also looked at what makes target setting effective, or what makes the method effective, and looked at these 4 primary factors came out through the analysis. There's the issue of ease of application. States and MPOs want something that it doesn't take a lot of staff time and resources to implement. On the other hand, we'd like methods that are technically robust and that account for many of the factors that affect performance. These are often somewhat in conflict, but there's a balance between those two. Third, issues encountered included ease of communication, being easy to explain the method, but also being able to explain the target that came out of that method. And does that target conform with the desired direction for improvement that agencies are typically looking for? And allows for policy consideration as well, incorporating other types of policy considerations and long-term goals into it. Ultimately, out of all these factors, that many of these you have to kind of balance in selecting a method. But ultimately, what we hear from agencies is that methods that are effective are those that help to inform investment decision-making, and those that also motivate stakeholders and decision makers to engage in discussions about the actions that help to meet those targets. And so even simple methods could help to get to those goals. In some cases, more complex and data intensive methods can also help to inform that process as well. So just highlight here, the guidebook addresses these 5 primary performance areas, which address each of the national measures. The guide does not specifically focus on the CMAQ emissions measures, but addresses each of the other primary areas. And within part 2 of the guidebook, we have essentially for each of those performance areas a menu of target setting methods with fact sheets that highlight for each method a little description of what it is, when it may be used, some of what's needed to implement that method, and advantages, limitations, and I think importantly, examples from states and MPOs around the country. I'll just highlight very briefly here, just a couple of these, just to give you a flavor of things in the guidebook. In the safety area, for instance, we have 4 primary methods that are identified. And so this first one here, you see this targeted reduction. This is an example of a state, in this case, Louisiana, that did a data-based analysis, but then essentially was setting a target based on an annual % reduction off of that off of the data that they have. A second approach is a time series trend analysis using statistical analysis, where a regression equation is developed to help forecast the future performance based on some factors or based on based on the time series trend over time, looking at how that trend is being affected. The third method is similar to the second, but accounts for other factors. And so in this case, we may have a time series trend, but also account for other factors. And one example here is from South Carolina, where they looked at the trend. They also analyzed some of the did some forecasting, but then also subtracted some of the, essentially accounting for some of the benefits in terms of reduction of fatalities based on crash modification factors, based on some investments in safety programs and how that might influence their performance. And then also finally, we have these multivariable statistical models, and Virginia DOT, Michigan DOT, and some other states have developed models that account for many factors affecting performance. I'll show you briefly here, just touch on also for reliability. This area had even more methods that were identified, even when we've grouped and classified them into different kinds of general methodologies. Here we have some simple methods like building off a baseline figure, but a second method is this time series trend as well. In this case, and one thing the guidebook highlights is that time series generally assumes that things will be the same over time or similar based on past trends. We recognized here for reliability, and states have clearly noted this with the COVID impact, the reliability shifted dramatically for the roadway system starting in 2000. And so here's some data on this slide from Oklahoma as part of the pilot, where they plotted the trend in percent of the interstate reliable over time. You could see in blue was fairly steady. Then after COVID hit, the reliability jumped dramatically. And then over time, we don't have the most recent data on this chart, but it went back down. And so thinking about time series trend analysis may also require considering how trends may have outliers or other factors. And so I won't get into all of these methods here now, but I will just note that there were some other methods like this performance risk analysis that involved looking at sort of the variability of reliability and doing this box and whisker plot where you look at sort of the range of reliability within each of the years to help you in setting a target. Here we also notice a very dramatic increase in the share of interstates reliable in 2020 and 2021. And then there's the segment risk analysis approach where some analysis was looking at individual segments and their potential to become more reliable or to become unreliable and how that might influence performance. So in any case, it gives you a flavor of some of the different types of methods that are in the guidebook, and there's a lot more information behind each of these, along with examples of how the agencies have implemented these methods. The last part of the guidebook, as I noted, addresses non-required measures, and it has some examples in 5 different areas: accessibility, greenhouse gas emissions, active transportation, transit ridership, and customer satisfaction. What I wanted to highlight is coming out of this guidebook, there's a series of workshops, web-based workshops that are being scheduled, or actually are planned, starting next week. I've got these on the screen here. These are all, we very much encourage you to register for these workshops if you're interested in learning more about specific methods in specific topic areas. So we have a series of 5 web-based workshops that are each going to be focusing on a specific performance area, and then a final webinar on lessons learned that will provide some highlights overall about effective target setting. We have different speakers from some different state DOTs and MPOs who will be presenting, but these are also intended to be real workshops where we want people to share information, ask questions, and learn from each other. And this information will be is available, but I would just say if you click on the link, or if you go to the TPM portal, it brings you up the calendar. And I wanted to thank Lori and Spy Pond for getting this up there. You can click on the individual webinars, and then it'll bring you to a registration page. So I'd encourage you to register for any of those. I think with that, I'll just note there's some also in-person workshops that are being scheduled. And I will close by just encouraging people to sign up for the individual webinars if you would like to learn more.
Thanks,
So with
Michael.
that, thank you, Fiona.
Oh, okay. Are you finished?
Yes.
Okay, all right. Thanks, Michael. And our last presentation today is from Anna Batista of High Street Consulting. Anna will provide a summary of the NCHRP 07-27 Making Targets Matter, Managing Performance to Enhance Decision Making, and what it means for target setting. Anna focuses on transportation performance management, the organizational underpinnings of successful performance improvements, and use of data to support decision making. She's gained national perspective on transportation for performance management through work with FHWA on MAP 21 performance measures, rulemaking, and research with NCHRP. Now I'll turn it over to Anna.
Thank you, Hannah, and thank you, everyone. So this is, I helped out Michael on the last project that he is leading with his team at ICF, and ICF helped us on this project, the Making Targets Matter. So it's been really interesting to work on these 2 kind of sister projects to look at the 2 sides of target setting. And, you know, what Michael described is really about the methods of setting your targets, whereas making targets matter was very much about what do you do after you've set targets? How do you make the process meaningful? And before I get started here, just because my little Zoom has disappeared, Kiana, can you just confirm you can hear me and see my screen?
Yes,
Great.
on both, yes.
Okay, so I'm going to kick off. We had a lot of fun with this project, creating these tailored, customized illustrations. And with those, we created a series of videos. So we just got revised videos set. So I want to share those with you today to kick off what this project is all about. So, you hear that?
Yes.
Making targets matter. Managing performance to enhance decision-making. If you work on performance issues, you have likely experienced the set it and forget it phenomenon. Performance is discussed with enthusiasm, targets are set, and the world moves on. Work continues as it always has, decisions are made the same way, and targets fade from the immediacy of today's tasks. How does an agency make their targets matter by driving later decisions? How can a practitioner learn which levers will move the needle on performance? One crucial answer to this is feedback. Feedback can be best understood from a commonplace example: your home heating system. In this system, a thermometer serves as a sensor to gather on-the-ground information about room temperature. When the temperature drops below the set point, a signal is sent along a pathway to turn on the furnace. This cycle is repeated to continually maintain a warm house. A similar cycle, informed by a similar set of sensors, pathways, information, action, and repetition, can also help deliver feedback in a complex system like the transportation network. This video series and accompanying guidebook discuss how your agency can develop people and data sensors to share information about transportation system conditions, establish pathways to bring information to your agency, and use that information to make adjustments and communicate your agency's performance story.
All right. So that's the quick overview of what our project's all about. And we'll dig into some of those a little bit today. So we do have a guidebook, which is in the final stages of the official NCHRP publication. It should be coming out soon. And then along with this video you just saw, we have 3 others that get into some of the details of those sensors and pathways and how you can use them. The main results of this work is that feedback framework, right? How can you conceptualize feedback to make it tangible? Break it down. We have a lot of strategies that we gleaned from our peer exchanges and discussions with a lot of practitioners out there, many of whom are on this call. So really trying to get into the nitty-gritty of how do you get that better feedback at your agency. And then we have a series of case studies of that, what we considered feedback in action, seeing some of these practices out there. One thing about the guide, I think one of the big principles when we were developing this was that we really wanted to go beyond just saying what to do, because we already have that. We have the TPM framework, we have performance-based planning and programming framework. A lot of us have structures and measures in place, and we kind of know what to do, but we all wanted to get very tangible about how to do it. What are the specific actions we can all take to make it a reality, right? It's kind of like finding the secret sauce and demystifying that secret. So that's the principle behind this guide. We're now in an implementation phase of this. So we have a new round of funding that involves a new series of peer exchanges, which I hope many of you would be interested in participating in. And with this new implementation phase, our goal is to really evolve the framework that we've already established, to deepen the strategies we've already developed, get more tactics and more examples, and develop new strategies. Hear from all of you about what other things you're doing that you're finding success in, and then report on those success stories, to have new case studies and have kind of sharing these experiences with the community. So just going back to kind of the foundations of it, we really started off asking, what does it mean to make targets matter? I think we all agree we want our targets to drive decisions. And so this is all about, well, how do we figure out what's going to drive performance? How do we know what information to look at? And that's that feedback, right? The feedback is what's going to optimize our performance. It's that is what I think is the secret sauce to good performance management. So the overall project thesis here, more accurate and more frequent feedback from the people and data that are experiencing the transportation network. That's what's going to help agencies make the decisions and take actions that will improve performance. So that feedback example of the thermostat in your home, you've got the sensor, information, pathway, action, and we want to break all these down and look at them in the transportation network, right? So you have partner agencies, you have the public, you have people out there using the network or working on the network. You might be staff in your agency, on the ground staff. These people have information about your network that could be really valuable to the people making decisions. Also, there's all that data that Walt had mentioned. There's more and more data all the time. Knowing where that is and how to make sense of it, then make ways to get that into your agency, analyze it, synthesize it, and then apply it in the areas that everyone is working on already. Long-term strategy and planning, use it to inform programming and even day-to-day operations. So these strategies to build better feedback really are we've broken down into 3 areas, right? There's one strategy to prepare your sensors, another set to establish pathways, and then put it into action. How do you use it? With sensors, we've kind of got the people focus side, building buy-in, right? This is getting your people sensors, getting in touch with them, getting to know them. We've got kind of the data side, get to know your data sensors, know what data is out there, learn the landscape and the ecosystem, and know who has data and how to get it. There's a lot of specific tactics in the guide about how to have these conversations and proactively make sure you know what data you have. Establishing pathways, have opportunities to get that information about your system into your agency. On the people side, you've got convening, right? Bring people together. These are opportunities to get that information to your agency. For the data side, it's these formalized assessments. If you've got data out there, you need a way to analyze it and set and establish a point at which you would bring that into the decision-making process. So there's some tactics on how to do that. Putting it all to work, you have to pull the trigger and take action, right? So know what options are at your disposal. You can try incremental change, and how do you actually take those first steps to making the changes? And finally, this has come up a lot. This is something we all talk about, is how do we tell our performance story? Let's use all this knowledge that we've gained and tell people what we're doing about it as an agency and making progress. So quick overview of those strategies, and kind of bringing it back to the topic of today, which is target setting. So as I mentioned, this project was really about what do you do after you've set targets? And the panel was very, very clear about that, right? So this took the premise, the targets are established, you just take that as a given, or we did when we started this. And now we're going to begin the work to make those targets meaningful, to make them matter. Having worked with Michael on the target setting, effective target setting guide, along with this Making Targets Matter, I think it's really made it clear to us that the process of target setting and the way you go about the target setting really is central to the work that you need to do to make those targets matter. They're not really 2 separate things. They're just a seamless transition from one thing to the next. Target setting and the process you do with that really hits on all major strategies that I just outlined. So you need to talk with lots of stakeholders, whether that's leadership, boards, the public, other people in your agency. You all need to come to agreement on what your targets should be and how they might guide future decisions. So you have to talk with these individuals. You have to get data. There are lots of meetings for target setting. The target setting process is an opportunity to have that pathway, to have the meetings where you're discussing these really important topics related to performance. It can integrate assessments. And throughout this target setting process, you really want to tell your story and use the outputs of it to make those changes to try and meet your targets. So I think it's something that you can apply all these strategies to the target setting process. And in particular, I want to just focus for a second on the federal measures, because one thing we heard a fair amount in the initial peer exchanges here was that, well, the federal targets don't really matter. They're too short term. I can't pull the lever to make changes to my bridge and pavement system in the next 2 years because everything's already set. There's not a lot of room there. And that may be true for some extent for the short-term targets. But we also heard in these discussions that there's also benefits, not just for whatever those particular target is, for the exact level it is, but that this requirement to set targets with all these entities that is going to be front and center was actually a real opportunity to get performance in front of leadership, to get people paying attention to it. That, you know, the numbers you come up with are not nearly as important as talking about the numbers. And so having these conversations around target setting is a really, really important opportunity to do all this work to make your targets matter. And that you should really integrate those things. So start making targets matter with your target setting process. So bring this kind of integrative approach to it, and then continue those strategies after the target is set. If you've done this work in the target setting process, you already have people lined up, you already know where data is on these important areas, to then continue that conversation after the targets are set in the work to meet those targets. So I think that was a big thing that we found through the course of both of these things. And now I just want to finish up with mentioning the last round of peer exchanges. So we're planning to do these in the fall or so, and we're looking for hosts. You know, we're going to have about 2 or 3 of these, and we are definitely looking for participants. We do have funds for travel. And so if you are interested in sharing your own experiences, if you're interested in hearing what some of your peers are up to, please get in touch with me. And I'm, you know, starting to develop those lists of who might be great participants. And I hope to hear from some of you. And once we have some locations and dates, I will get that out to the community, just as Michael has done. So that's it.
All right, thank you, Anna. All right, that was a great set of presentations, and we're now at the Q&A and wrap-up part. And so I think the best way, it looks to me like on the chat part that people have had their answers, their questions answered through the chat. And I would suggest that people just either raise their hands or just speak up, unmute yourself and ask the question. I'll kick it off to all of our panelists to ask, you know, based on the work you have done, both through the research or as federal highways leaders, what's your sense of where practice is today in the agencies that are delivering delivering transportation and managing transportation performance? And, you know, and if you were to kind of on a scale of 1 to 10, saying, you know, 10 is everyone's doing it exactly right and perfectly, and we're in this well-oiled machine, to 1 being, you know, no one knows what it is and we're just getting started. Where would you say we are as a country? Who wants to start?
I'll answer that with a range, and, you know, maybe a rough estimate of that 50th percentile. Mm-hmm. You know, maybe slightly wider than that. I think some agencies are still at the kind of 4 mark and really kind of getting started with a lot of this, and then, you know, going up through maybe around 8, I think, for some agencies, with a lot right in the middle between that, was what I would say. Michael, what do you think?
I would agree. I mean, I think we saw some great examples from states and MPOs that have done an amazing job of really trying to do really good technical analysis to set targets. I think there's a balance that a lot of agencies are playing in terms of, the amount of time and energy they want to invest in the target setting process. And, some agencies have made a choice to, I think, just use more simple, or even policy-based kinds of approaches. And so I think maybe it all goes back a little bit to, like you said, how the agencies value that and how they want to use this target setting process as part of, like you said, making targets matter. So definitely see kind of a range, but definitely not at the 0 and 1 range. I think a lot of states have learned a lot over the last few years.
Yeah, I agree. Everyone has something going on with performance management at this point. And I would say nobody is at the 10. Nobody has the process part figured out completely. Like people are getting close and making adjustments all the time. But I think that integrative approach that I think that Matt kind of referenced is how do you really integrate that into decisions is still a work in progress for everyone, even the advanced agencies.
Yeah. Alexis and Walt, do you want to say anything?
Yeah, I'll just chime in that I agree with that range. I think that is, it's a very similar experience that we've had in our work with states and MPOs. And I also think, some of it comes down to resource challenges and how advanced they are, staffing issues, and other agencies are more driven from a performance perspective. Others are goal-oriented, goal-driven, and how those connect down to transportation performance implementation does vary. But yeah, I think we're seeing some similar perspectives there.
Great. Thank you. All right. Are there any questions? Maybe Ryan, do you want to talk about your peer exchange?
Sure, I'd be more than happy to. It was an exchange brought together by our FHWA liaison here in Utah. It's going to be the 23rd. I know there's that bridge one, which I'm so bummed I can't go to that one, but we do have someone from Kentucky that will be speaking at ours the same time as yours. So we should be getting both the best world. It'll be an awesome thing, but we're just going over performance measures and trying to figure out how we can implement them from state to state, as well as, feds to locals, and best practices that are being used. So I wish I would have had this presentation because I probably wouldn't have done the virtual peer exchange, because this is great stuff, but it is just another caveat that we can add to your guys' quiver. So please feel free to join if you want. No hard feelings if you guys do the bridge one too. So just know that we're trying to take all that we can in from it. So thank you guys.
Thanks, Ryan. Any questions from the audience for the panelists? All right, I have one and I'll keep going. The one I have is, did you find any, well, I guess let's put it more as like percentages. So I think that because of the federal requirements, clearly everyone is able to understand what a target is and set them. They have to do that. But there is a difference between doing what is minimally required for the federal requirements versus actually believing and using target setting to truly shape how decisions are made and how investments are made. And so I'm curious your views on what percentage of the agencies you have had contact with are really doing that latter. Michael, you have to start this time.
Okay, well, I was going to say this Anna may want to speak to from the point of making targets matter, which is, I think, what you're getting at, really. But
yeah,
I will say that even in the pilot testing, I think we heard some of the states wanting to test out some more complex methods for using statistical analysis or regression analysis, but having, some limitations, like as noted, in staffing, time, data collection, and all of those elements. So I guess my perspective is just that there's a balance that agencies, they're doing it because they need to set these targets. They want to get something out of it, but in some cases may not always want to go, much further in terms of the amount of effort going into setting the specific target. But I do think the intent of having targets to inform and promote performance improvement is something that seems to come across, really around the country. And so I think the spirit of it, at least I see generally, being there.
Anna?
Oh, I don't know, I mean, maybe it's definitely the exception more than the rule, like the kind of, as you put it, like really integrating it and taking that approach. It is a cultural shift. It is a huge difference in culture, and that just takes time. So, it feels, it's been 10 years that we've started this NPM, this federal target setting process, and that has made it familiar to everyone. But even 10 years is not enough to really get to this part where your whole agency has changed its thinking. All the staff are on board with using performance measures to inform decisions and allocate resources and get over those silos and historical processes. So maybe 10 or 15% of agencies are there, well established. But all the time, I just had two kind of surprise conversations recently where I learned about agencies that were doing this that I didn't know before were, at least in pockets. And I'm always delighted to see, it seems like there's always a new story that I'm hearing of somebody really doing it. And that's exciting. So that's what I hope to get to with these variations.
Good. Ryan?
Like the disconnect that we do have with the federal compared to the state is creating some type of tie, or I would say connection point to those measures. A lot of times we look at federal measures as this overlapping goal that there is no, I would say, tethers to hold to. And that's what we're trying to incorporate here at UDOT, as well as with this peer exchange, is seeing how people are tethering those down to the state agencies to make relevant performance measures that can articulate or control those federal ones. Because if we're not able to put the tie between the two, then the people that are doing the work on the ground will never see the relevance of what their work is doing. And to make that correlation from top to bottom is really what I'm trying to correlate with our group, to say performance measures aren't just a federal measure, that you have all impact on this. By setting a barrier on the road, that creates some type of safety measure that then correlates to the FHWA measure and being able to tie them. So I think that's the next step that we have to create, is that tie from top to bottom.
All right. There's a question in the chat from Richard Dunn asking, are any states linking their bridge preservation and pavement preservation efforts, the funds expended, to achieve their performance target? So I'm thinking kind of, are you doing some kind of trade-off across the two programs when you're doing your target setting exercise and investment decision making?
Yeah, I would say this seems pretty common. Michael, do you want to speak to that?
Not specifically. I was going to say, I don't think we specifically looked at that as part of this study, but I do think that the peer workshops we have on bridge target setting and pavement target setting, that these are some of the discussions we want to have at the peer workshops. So I would encourage you again to try to register for those and also learn from others.
Yeah,
I think that this kind of stuff is coming through a lot in the TAMPs, which everyone is developing right now. So Richard, I think if you join those workshops, I'm sure a lot of these discussions would come up. My sense is that of the performance areas, trying to make that link between bridge spending and pavement spending is probably more advanced than in most of the other areas, because it's a little bit more clearly within the agency's control, a direct connection of doing the action, right? Doing your projects and building to the outcome Whereas, a little reliability, congestion, and certainly safety, it sometimes feels really hard to draw those connections. So it's really hard to get those in the other areas. All
right, I think we're just out of time on the Q&A, and let me just quickly wrap up here and thank Matt, Alexis, Walt, Michael, and Anna. And we also want to thank the TPM Pooled Fund lead, Christos Xenofontos, and all of the Pooled Fund members for everything you do to support this webinar series and help continue this webinar series by signing up for the technical service program. And to all of you online, we appreciate your joining us at this very important dialogue, and we hope to see you next time. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.